Vi har med oss här människorättsadvokaten David Matas som också är Nobelprisnominerad. Han har i princip ägnat sitt liv åt mänskliga rättigheter. Han har jobbat med frågor om judarna. Han har varit med i Raoul Wallenberg-institutet. Han är en källa av massor med information. Ska vi se David, slow so we get the cable right.
Får jag korrigera lite? Han är advokaten i fallet Raoul Wallenberg, inte bara i institutet. Ja, han jobbar för det.
Ja, precis. Och han är en av tänkarna i Raoul Wallenberg-institutet. Så att det är en glädje att kunna presentera David här. Och han kommer ju specifikt prata om det som är det hemskaste kanske idag, det som vi ser i Kina. Vi har hört om alla dessa utrensningar som har pågått och hur många människor som har fått sätta till livet. Och man tror ju kanske inte att det här är sant. Det handlar alltså om dagligen hur människor mördas för sina organ. Alltså, jag sa igår i riksdagen där att ett uttalande, det förstår det kanske nu när man gärna har berättat bakgrunden, men partiet ser alltså massorna, de är bara till för partiet. Människor har inget annat värde. Och det uttalar man ju inte direkt idag, men när vi lyssnar här på Meta så förstår vi att det fungerar. Det är ju som kreatur, man tjänar pengar på oskyldiga människor, vad vi kallar samhällsfångar. Okay, Metas, I just told them that you're going to talk about this organ harvesting and please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to talk first of all about the evidence about organ harvesting. Secondly, what can be done about it, and then thirdly, I'll leave some time for questions. I'm an international human rights lawyer. I live in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. I do a lot of writing, speaking, and general advocacy on human rights issues. I was asked in 2006 to look into this issue, whether there's been organ transplant abuse in China. There was a woman with a pseudonym Annie in April 2006, or March 2006, gave a public statement that her ex-husband had been harvesting the corneas of practitioners of the spiritually based set of exercises Falun Gong in Sujiatan Hospital in Shenyang City in Linnong Province in China, that other doctors had been harvesting other organs, that the Falun Gong practitioners were being executed through organ extraction, their bodies were being cremated. Chinese government denied that. An NGO, the Coalition to Investigate Persecution Against Falun Gong, they went to the Congressional Executive Commission on China in Washington, D.C. and asked the Congressional Executive Commission to do something about it. And the Congressional Executive Commission said, well, you can't do anything without a human rights report. The coalition then struck up a list of 20 names of people who could do such a thing. And my name was on the list, David Kilgore's name was on the list. They went to David Kilgore and said, would you join in this effort? And he said, you can't do a report with 20 people, but I can work with David Matas because I know him. And so the two of us set out. And we weren't given any money, we weren't given any instructions, we weren't given any data, we were we weren't even asked to show what Annie said was true. We were just asked to determine whether it was true or not. Now, the question, from my point of view, represented a conundrum, because right off we were told there's no victims. I mean, there are victims, but they're dead and their bodies are cremated. You can't do an autopsy, you can't talk to anyone who was victimized. We're also told that everything is institutionalized. The victims come from prisons, they go to state hospitals, so the only witnesses are perpetrators. And I deal a lot with crimes against humanity, and I'm a very reluctant to rely on perpetrator evidence because I find it pretty much completely self-exonerating. And what's more, perpetrator evidence is not going to give you a sense of scale. It'll tell you about this happened in one place and so on, but the question is what's happening generally. So that was a second problem. Third problem is the records are all going to be internal to the government of China and the Communist Party of China, so no records. So how are we going to either prove or disprove with this kind of evidentiary context? Well, so what David Kilgore and I did is we set up evidentiary trails, both of proof and disproof. How do we prove this if it's true, and how do we disprove it if it's not true? And we had a number of those, and basically the evidence establishing that this was happening, the trails establishing this happened, all produced something. The trails in which we attempted to establish that it was not happening really didn't go anywhere. We produced a report, June 2006, second version, January 2007, third version in book form in August 2009, all under the title of Bloody Harvest. We concluded that not only was this happening in Sujiatan Hospital, it was happening across China. It wasn't only happening during the period where Annie's ex-husband was working as a doctor, but from 2001 to the date of our report. The report then generated some publicity. We got some media interviews. One of the people who interviewed us was Ethan Gutman, who is an American journalist working in the UK. He got interested in the issue. He wrote his own book, basically coming to the same conclusion we did, called The Slaughter. We then, in 2016, wrote a joint update to our two independent pieces of work, which was looking only at the issue of transplant volumes. One of the evidentiary trails that we were both dealing with is the government announced transplant volumes, which were quite high, 10,000 a year, and we were trying to figure out where these were coming from. The government, as is typical of the Communist Party, wasn't consistent on this. At one point they said it was all donations. Another point they said it was all prisoners, but all prisoners sentenced to death and then executed who, to atone for their crimes, had donated their organs. They never said it was prisoners of conscience, but we couldn't, I mean, this obviously wasn't the only evidentiary trail, but all three of us couldn't find any other explanation for this source than prisoners of conscience. In 2016 we decided, well, a lot of the other things the Chinese Communist Party says are wrong. What about transplant volume? So what we did is we started looking at individual hospitals to see, hospital by hospital, what the transplant volumes added up to. And we got 10 times the figures the Chinese were officially producing, 100,000 a year as opposed to 10,000 a year. We did that in 2016. We also together formed an NGO called the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China. We were the co-founders, but there's a kind of a volunteer staff person, Susie Hughes, working out of Australia, that's doing a lot of the day-to-day work. And through ETACT and through Susie Hughes, we established an independent tribunal to investigate organ transplant abuse in China, appointed 7 people with whom basically we'd had no prior contact, but had an international reputation in China or human rights or the law. And they then just sat in London. They had hearings, they read documents, and came to a conclusion that indeed this forced organ harvesting was happening beyond a reasonable doubt, and that it was a crime against humanity and a crime of torture. And they released their report in June of this year, and you can read about their judgment and the hearings and the witnesses. It's all on the internet. Now, in terms of the evidence, I could say a few things, but as you can imagine, it's quite voluminous now. In addition to the 2 books and the update and the tribunal report, there's a number of documentaries that have been made. Some of them you can just watch on the internet, some of them You'd have to pay for them, but you can watch them if you pay on the internet. There's also a number of NGOs that have been established to deal with this issue. I mentioned the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China, which the three of us founded, but there's also Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, and there are a number of country-specific NGOs that are dealing with this issue. There's the World Organization to Investigate Persecution Against the Falun Gong that's been doing some work on this issue. There's also some academic literature on this issue as well. There's an article I co-authored on genocide studies, a journal of genocide studies that deals with this issue. So by now, I mean, this is 13 years ago since we started, so by now the evidence is voluminous, and it's kind of very difficult for me to summarize it in a word or two, and also it keeps on changing because the landscape keeps on changing. But what I can say is that this abuse continues to this day. Now, I wanted to say a bit about why I'm here in Gothenburg, and why am I not in Shanghai or Beijing? I mean, that's where the problem is. But, well, first of all, I couldn't get into China. I tried to get into China. I went to the Chinese consulate in Ottawa and said, I want to go to China, and David Kilgore, we want to go to China to investigate this. And they said, no, you're not going to get a visa for that. You don't need a visa for that. We'll tell you what's going on there. And so that didn't that didn't go anywhere. In order to get the visa, we needed a letter of invitation. There was a human rights lawyer with whom I'd been in contact, Gao Zhisheng. So he sent us a letter of invitation. Now Gao Zhisheng, who had done also some work on this issue and spoken up about it, he's not a Falun Gong practitioner. I'm not a Falun Gong practitioner. David Kilgore isn't. Ethan Gutman isn't. But anyhow, when he after he sent us this letter and done some other activity, he's written an open letter to the Communist Party about this issue. He got his license revoked as a lawyer. He got his office closed down. All his staff was fired. He was arrested. He was beaten. He was tortured. His family fled. They're now in the U.S. They've been recognized as refugees. And what he said is, if you get involved in human rights in China, you become a human rights victim yourself, and he's a classic example of that. There's also, of course, the media, but the foreign media have a great deal of difficulty dealing with this issue. I mean, they're not arrested if they report about it, but they're basically denied access. There's been a couple of good reporters reporting on this issue. Kirsten Tatlow from the New York Times, Nathan Vandercliff from the Globe and Mail. Kirsten Tatlow did a series of articles on this issue and then basically lost access. I mean, she wasn't kicked out, but she couldn't talk to anybody. She couldn't find out anything. So eventually she lost her job with the New York Times. And now she's just doing independent work in Germany. I know with Japanese reporters, there is an agreement that basically says Japanese reporters get access only if they agree to say kind things about China. The reporters will tell you that the agreement no longer has practical effect, but it's still there. And so the reality is, if anybody's going to do something about this, it's got to be people here, people outside of China. And of course, getting people outside of China mobilized about something in China is more difficult in the sense it's geographically distant, it's culturally distant, it's linguistically different. But on the other hand, I do think it makes the point that what we're dealing with is a crime against humanity, and a crime against humanity is a crime against us all, and we all should be concerned. Now, Mannion had suggested maybe I show some slides, but no more than 5. So, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you 5 slides, which will give you some of the evidence with which we're dealing. When we started our work in China, there was in 2006, the organ transplant abuse was a lot more public than it is now. There's been, I would say, a rolling cover-up. As we cite information, it disappears. We archive everything, but you can't get it on Chinese websites anymore, and the data stream disappears. And the transplant tourism into China was massive. I mean, according to Chinese figures, it was 20% of what they were doing, and they said they were doing 10,000 a year, transplants a year, which would be 2,000 according to their figures. And indeed, they show it year by year for the China Liver Transplant Registry, and in the last year before our report came up, they showed 2,600 liver transplants to foreigners. And that's at their figure of 10,000 a year. But if you take the actual figures, which at the low end of the scale would have been 60,000 a year, you're getting a multiple of 6 for all that. And it wasn't just volumes we could pick up through the internet, and these were supposedly official volumes. China has 4 transplant registries, and the liver transplant registry is located in Hong Kong, and they used to, until we put out a report, they used to report aggregate data. I actually met the head of the transplant registry, Wang Haibo, at one transplant conference after the data disappeared, and I said, "What happened to it? Why'd you take down the aggregate data?" He said, "Well, we didn't like the way people were using it." He said, "People can still have it. All they have to do is tell us why they want it, and if we like the way they're going to use it, we'll give it to them." That's what he said to me. Anyhow, so they had these brokers promoting transplant tourism to China, saying you can get a transplant on demand, including vital organs. And indeed, this is one of the people who's also become involved in this issue as a researcher, also not a practitioner, Falun Gong practitioner, is Jay Lavi, a transplant surgeon in Israel. And what mobilized him is he had a patient, I mean, he read our work, but he had a heart patient on the waiting list for heart transplant. He says, "I booked a heart transplant in China for 2 months from now." So he says, "I mean, how can you book a heart transplant for 2 months in advance? I mean, don't you realize what that means?" And the patient says, "Doesn't matter, I'm going." And he went, he got his heart, he came back. And so, and that's what these brokerage sites were promoting. And they had price lists. And so this is one of them, the CITNAC, the China International Transplant Network Assistance Center. And they had, this was the earliest price list, December 5th, 2004, and you could see the kidneys 56,000 and livers 98,000 and so on. The price lists evolve. If you go to let's see if I can get the next slide up. I don't know how to see that. Okay, and this one is, you can see this is the next one. This is April 7th, 2005. Prices go up. The kidney is 62,000 instead of 56,000. The price list after that, this is September 6, 2006. This is after our report comes out. Price list goes up to 65,000. Now, this is the building in which they were working October 30th, 2004. I'll just show a picture of it. This is the same institute, December 30th, 2006, which gives you an idea of the amount of money that's being made from this business. I mean, there's a combination here for what's going on of repression of Falun Gong, dehumanization. There's the shift from socialism to capitalism. The system had been used to getting organs from prisoners, and then with the repression of Falun Gong, they had an awful lot more prisoners. And with the shift from socialism to capitalism, they were losing money, government money. So on the one hand, they had a dire need of money as they shifted from socialism to capitalism. On the other hand, they had this unexpected bonanza of an inexhaustible supply of organs because of the mass detention of Falun Gong in the hundreds of thousands, arbitrarily detained, indefinitely detained. The practitioners would not tell their jailers who they were to protect their families, as a result of which the jailers didn't know who they were, the family didn't know where they were. It's a very vulnerable population. So those are my 5 slides. The question becomes, what can we do about it? And I have a number of different suggestions. Some of them are things that Sweden can do on its own. Some of them come from the European Union. One comes from the Council of Europe, and some relate to the United Nations. Now, in terms of what Sweden can do on its own, one is criminal prosecution. Sweden, as does many countries, has universal jurisdiction legislation for torture, crimes against humanity. This China tribunal said that what was happening to Falun Gong and to Uyghurs, because more recently, I mean, as you can imagine, over the years with this massive transplantation industry, the Falun Gong detention population has depleted. I mean, there's still many there, but not as many as before. And there's also, when we started our work, there was no national organ distribution system for China, but they did set one up in 2010. In 2006, all organs were being sourced locally, but that's no longer the case. And also, there's been an improvement in transplant technology so that organs can survive longer outside the body than they used to in 2006. The combination of which means that it's possible. I mean, of course, the Uyghurs are all in Xinjiang. The Falun Gong were everywhere in China, which made them initially a lot more attractive as an organ transplant source than the Tibetans or the Uyghurs who were geographically confined. But now it's not such a big problem to move Uyghur organs around China, and in fact, there's I've also been speaking recently in Denmark and Finland, where I had some Uyghur colleagues speaking with me, or a Uyghur colleague, Enver Todi, and somebody, and Ethan Hauptmann, who's written also a lot about, Ethan Gutman, who's written a lot about the Uyghurs, and Enver Todi has pictures at different airports, and a couple of them in Xinjiang and one in a neighboring province, showing on the floor lanes, signs embedded in the lane saying VIP lane for people transplanting or transporting organs, so what you have is a combination of victimization of these two populations, prisoners of conscience, and in smaller numbers, the Tibetans and the Eastern Lightning House Christians. So these acts are crimes against humanity and torture, international crimes. And international crimes means that the crime doesn't have to be committed in Sweden, it doesn't have to be committed by a Swede, it doesn't have to be committed against a Swede. The person can be prosecuted if only the person is here. And of course there are people visiting from China all the time in one guise or another, some of whom are complicit in these abuses, and it's just a matter of paying attention to who shows up and what their history is. So that's one possibility. Another is what's called Mänskliga type legislation. Sweden doesn't have it now, but it could enact that legislation. There's only 6 countries in the world that have it: Canada, UK, US, and the 3 Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And what it does is it allows for public listing of criminal populations and seizing of their assets and barring their entry. and potentially prosecuting them if they show up. And it's a useful exercise, partly because it does allow for public listing. Most criminal investigations, you never find out about what's going on until the actual charge is laid, and so this is a good type of warning. There could be a very specific immigration ban, which I suggest would be useful. The United States has one, which I mean, a lot of countries will ban people with a criminal record, but there could be a ban that says specifically if you're complicit in organ transplant abuse, you can't get into the country, and I think that would be useful. There needs to be a much more elaborate development of ethics in this area. The Transplantation Society developed an ethical policy about contact with China that was useful, and it was developed, the head of the ethics committee at the time was somebody, Anika Tebel, who was a transplant surgeon. She's now head of a hospital, and she isn't really into transplant surgery anymore, and isn't involved in the Transplantation Society in the same way. But there needs to be something specifically about collaboration, and what the Transplantation Society has done could be a useful guide. There needs to be something about patient counseling. What are doctors supposed to be telling patients if they want to go to China for a transplant? What are doctors supposed to be doing with patients when they come back from China with a transplant? There needs to be a lot more elaborate development of ethical standards. And ethical standards needn't necessarily be legislated. You know, they could just be professional criteria for entry into the profession or staying in the profession. There's also, I would suggest, the need for mandatory reporting, because how do we know how many people have gone from Sweden to China for transplants? The answer is we don't know, and we don't know because it's subject to doctor-patient confidentiality. I mean, we may get some anecdotal evidence, but we don't have accurate and total statistics. And the only way we're going to get them is through compulsory reporting, and which would require health professionals to report to health administrators about what's happening. There needs to be something to deal with bodies exhibits, legislation that requires verifiable consent from the people before death or the families after death. These bodies exhibits exist in China, or they come from China. The sources come from the same sources as a lot of these organs for transplants, and they just shouldn't be given free rein as they are. There's a European Union resolution which calls on all member states to publicly condemn organ transplant abuse in China and raise awareness of this issue among the citizens traveling to China. That resolution hasn't been implemented in Sweden, and it could be. There's a Swedish China human rights dialogue, and there's a European Union human rights dialogue. Those dialogues need to raise this issue and state publicly it has been raised and what the result is. There's a Council of Europe Convention on trafficking in human organs, which obligates states parties to enact legislation which would have extraterritorial effect, criminalizing complicity in organ transplant abuse and brokerage and advertising and so on. There are 9 ratifying states, 15 signatory states. Sweden hasn't ratified it, Sweden hasn't signed it. There's the UN Human Rights Council, which meets 3 times a year. Sweden, there's an agenda item called Situations of Concern to the Human Rights Council around the world. Sweden speaks on it. Sweden spoke on it in June. Sweden spoke on it in this past week in September. Spoke about China, but didn't speak about Falun Gong, didn't speak about organ transplant abuse, and really needs to do both. There's the UN General Assembly. There was a recommendation of the China Tribunal that the UN General Assembly passed a resolution asking the International Commission of Justice for an advisory opinion about whether or not this forced organ transplantation is genocide. And Sweden could certainly take an initiative there. There's also finally the United Nations Security Council, which has the authority to raise an issue and bring it to the International Criminal Court, whether the issue arises in the territory of a state party to the treaty of the court or not. China hasn't signed the treaty, but if the Security Council passes such a resolution, the court could look at the matter. China has a veto on the Security Council, so they're unlikely to allow that to happen, but it would be a useful exercise simply to raise the matter. Well, that's what I wanted to say, just kind of in terms of evidence and potential remedies, and I would like to leave it open for some questions if the chair says I have enough time to do so.
Yes, yes, of course, David. Yeah, it's hard evidence, I can say. Even as we say, we don't have a smoking gun, but there's no doubt about what's happening. And I think also with all these things we saw here, what we could do, but I understand that's not so easy to implement, but like the basic level, what we can do is that we are being informed. And as we see, actually we had from the EU proclamation that we have to inform our citizens what's going on. And that's not happening. I don't think you all know what's happening. But because you took your time to come here today, we are at the basic level, we know something is happening. And then it's up to you to influence your friends, politicians, whoever have any say. So please remember that.